and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to The Future is Female. This is the show where we find the extraordinary in every woman. I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Dr Vilashini Somiah, who is a senior lecturer with the Gender Studies program at Universiti Malaya's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Now, she was recently elected the 2026 chair of the Southeast Asia Council at the Association for Asian Studies in the US, and the AAS is the governing body of the world's largest academic organizations dedicated to Asian studies. Dr Vila is the first ever Southeast Asian scholar based in Southeast Asia to chair the Southeast Asia Council since the council's founding in 1970. So it's an honor to have her here. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Mel. This is so great.
I mean, what an honor. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
For this really illustrious appointment.
Well, we try.
And you succeeded. And I'm sure it's the first of many hopeful appointments in your career, Vila.
Thank you. So kind of you.
I've known you for a while now.
Yeah.
We've spoken several times. You're a regular guest on my other show, Consider This. I've always wondered what drew you to gender studies. I've always wondered what got you interested in anthropology and gender studies, and whether you always imagined yourself working in academia.
No, actually, that's a brilliant question. And to be really candid and honest, in one's youth, one always imagines themselves a sort of celebrity. Oh. Do you remember MTV?
Oh, no.
Yeah, I bet the kids don't.
Did you want to be an MTV host?
I wanted to be an MTV host. I thought I was made of the stuff of it, and I thought I hardly had to work and I could just listen and watch music videos all day. But obviously YouTube ruined that, and in the turn of the millennium. But I think to really answer your question is that, at this point, I'm sure everybody knows this, or many people know this, but at that point, I come from Sabah. I have an indigenous Sabahan mother. And I have an Indian father, and I spent most of my childhood in Sabah before we moved to Penang. And really, I think when Malaysians see themselves in the larger scheme of things, they see themselves in terms of the social identity they straddle. Yeah. And I always was told, and I understood my position in society at large is that I occupied a minority identity, right? And I think what a lot of people don't talk about being a minority is that it's incredibly nuanced. You can be a minority with power, you can be a minority without, you can be a member of the status quo without power too, right? And these things are incredibly complicated and complex. But, you know, really diving into that was that I saw myself as a person with very little influence in the world. That didn't bother me. But, you know, I think when I finally entered university, I would say by luck most of the time, because as I said, the plan was to become a superstar, and most superstars don't go to school, right? But my minority parents said, I'm sorry, we're poor, so you're going to have to study. You don't have a choice. And so if all things fail, you'll be a housewife with a degree. And that was, I guess, a pretty decent way of heading forward. And when I entered, I think I was really introduced to a lot of ways in which high school doesn't inform you of the ways in which we talk about the world. Yes. Right? And really talking about the world is seeing yourself in that world. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is that everything informs the way we see ourselves, right? From our gender to our ethnic identity to the income group that we straddle to everything. You know, that was a crash course on intersectionality. And I think really breaking down a lot of these identity markers helped me recognize that there was a lot that we weren't talking about, right? We often talk about Malaysia in the study of Malaysia in terms of its policies and its economic growth. But suddenly there was a way of talking about everyday Malaysians that I didn't have an opportunity to do it. And gender studies and anthropology, which are the two areas in which I work with, looked at people. And what it is that they were saying rather than what somebody else was saying about them.
So talk to me about your research, because you focus a lot on marginalized communities, with migrants, Bornean women particularly, and you being mixed heritage yourself. How did that inform where you wanted to take your work, where you wanted to take your research, based on the gaps that you noticed in the literature? Talk to me a little bit about how you wanted your work to fill those gaps.
You know, I think many of us who are Asian, we come from a legacy in which your mother tells you a lot about your place in the world, right? I'm no different. I think in whatever way she could, she wanted me to inherit a lot of her legacies. And before her, her mother. And so I constantly had an understanding in which I realized I never saw people like my mother or her mother or the women that I grew up with in the works that I read.
Wow.
And even when I was introduced to works on Borneo, they were often written by Western scholars, right? Or scholars of privilege.
And the lens, therefore, is different.
Correct. So it's almost like, you know, reading about yourself through an uncanny valley lens. It's the same and yet so different, right? There's something that's not right about what we're reading.
Not quite human.
It's not quite human. It's almost not quite there. And I really felt that, you know, I had great mentors. I had great professors that came before me that said, you have an opportunity to add to that. And so in many ways, I gravitated to the work in Sabah. And the kind of women and marginalized communities in Sabah, because we often talk about them in such disparaging, disprivileged language, right? And if there was a way to also recognize that there is agency and empowerment amidst squalor, I think there is a real exercise that we can learn, you know, something to learn from that exercise.
That's so true. Sometimes there's this pity lens that all the narrative, the conversation, the dialogue, the discourse is funneled through this pity lens, poverty porn almost. What then does feminism look like when it's not shaped by urban centers, by elite perspectives, but through the lived realities of Bornean women, for example?
Sure. I think people get feminism very wrong from this point of view. They see it then as just a, you know, elevation of women at all costs. And this includes, you know, disparaging men in that process as well, right? But the feminism that I was introduced to is one that says there is a capacity for all of us to live in a world where we're equal. And I need to point this out, not uniform, equal. Equality and equity particularly works on different ways, but it's that everybody feels that they've got something to contribute and that everybody feels that there's something contributed back to them. And, you know, I think especially when we're looking at this sort of feminism, and, you know, there are many kinds of feminism, the way in which there are many kinds of, I don't know, policy studies and people who study political science, right? There are many ways to approach the study of feminism. The ones that, you know, in the way that I'm sort of looking at it is that there are multicultural, multi-narrative perspectives that all have power to it, right? And ultimately, this is what I teach. When we look at a place like Sabah, similar in areas like places like, you know, maybe orang asli kampungs scattered throughout Malaya, is that we have to pay attention to the fact in which they are, as you said, they cannot constantly be understood from a lens of the lesser, the other, to be sympathized always. That they are in many ways also trying to empower themselves. They are trying to achieve agency. We're just not listening to it. And it teaches us a lot about the ways in which we're talking about other people as well.
Right. I think the danger in having this lens of, you know, this, oh, poor them, this charity lens, is that you also then expect them to always be grateful.
Right.
You know, there's a trope that we expect the less disadvantaged or the less privileged to fulfill. And I think the lack of agency, we fail to recognize the lack of agency. I'm so curious to know how you are going to leverage your new platform as the in this wonderful, prestigious society. When you've said all of these things to me, I think it speaks volumes about this growing movement about decolonizing academia, really taking back or being empowered to view our community, our society through our own lens, through the lived realities of our own. How are you going to use this platform, Vila?
I mean, you asked the best questions, and I pale in comparison in the way I can answer you. I kind of need to foreground everything by saying that the AAS as an organization is I've known of the AAS even since I was an undergrad, right? These are the places in which we've had superstar academics used to go into those spaces, really talking about issues in Malaysia and the region and so on and so forth. And we've also had such giants of academics coming there. You know, people like James C. Scott, you know, in his passing, even Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim sort of like tweeted, you know, was so sad to see him go simply because he's contributed so much to Malaysian studies and Southeast Asian studies, right? People like Ben Anderson. By and large, Western scholars, I get that. But I need to say that my participation in this space has, for the most part, been just a contributing academic. Going on panels, having a conversation, you know, meeting up with friends. It's been really, you know, I would say, participatory.
Okay.
At the point in which I was voted onto the council, honestly, I didn't see any of that happening.
You didn't expect it?
No, not at all. Simply because I think also, and we internalize this in many ways, right? People coming from much more well-recognized universities worldwide make it to these spaces. And we're talking about the Oxbridges, Harvard, Stanford. These are the people who, by and large, generally make it to these spaces, right? So, you know, what is a scholar working on, like, you know, feminism of Malaysia from the University of Malaya doing in these spaces, right? And this is not to put down or any of our universities. It's about access, and I recognize that. But somehow or other, I made it in, right? And
well, what do you think it was? I mean, I don't want. I know you may. Some women have this tendency not to want to toot their own horn, but honestly, candidly speaking, what do you think made them say, "Hey, let's have Vila at the table because I think she has something to contribute"?
Well, you know, if this was not for polite audiences, it's because I knew how to crack a joke or two. All right,
sense of humor got you far.
Sense of humor definitely got me very far, and I think also because I've learned this art of taking the work I do very seriously, but not myself, right? And I think there's an importance in also recognizing that. It's important to always put the people first, not necessarily myself. And I think a lot of people, and you're right, maybe sometimes women have to learn to put themselves in the top. They really know how, they really need to be able to sort of say, wait a minute, I've worked really hard to get here. And I recognize that. It is a lot of hard work. But I think also there is a turn that's happening globally. There is a great disturbance that's happening in the force in the world today, right? In the way in which we are looking at superpowers, in the way in which we are looking at, you know, masculine political spaces, right? And we can get into that conversation later. And suddenly, if somebody, you know, you've had a set of 7 candidates that are fielding themselves for the position of a council member, is that my answer was very simple. If you feel that it's time to vote for somebody who is an outlier, who might say something that's never been said before, somebody who represents, you know, a face or a community that's hardly ever made it in, then this is your time to, you know, participate in an occupancy movement, right? And I think that was my message, that it's not about me. It's about the symbol of representation. It can start with any one of us. It just happened to have started with me, but it cannot end with me, right? We now know that there are many people like me out here, and we should now funnel a possibility in which they can participate.
So first of many, and not kind of a token. So one day it will be, you know, the norm. Talk to me a little bit about this growing disturbance in the force that you're noticing. Is it growing? Is there momentum, especially in the academia space? I know there's really been a lot of talk about that, but what are you observing, and is this something that we should be paying attention to?
I think so, because I think it is a microcosm for many things that are happening around the world. I don't think it is an unusual narrative to have heard in the past, and you may have heard this as well, Mel. Want to do well, leave the country. Right? Want to do well, get outside. You can't stay here. You've got to go out there and compete outside in the Western world. Go to America, go to Europe, you know, one of that. And suddenly, it's not so much about that. It's not so much about that because suddenly our notions of stability and our notions of progress have changed. That we can have far better stability in these parts of the world. And I'm not saying that everybody is suddenly assuming this position that they have to be, you know, they have to have a sense of responsibility to return. But I think also there's that desire to give back. And not give back to, not necessarily nation state, but certainly give back to people that, you know, correct. The familiar is important. You want to give, but you can't always straddle this position of being the token. It's tiring, and it's so yesterday, right? And you want somebody else to continue this legacy of there's something here. We've got something to offer.
There's always the counterbalance, though. For any time we see any kind of a progressive movement moving ahead, there's always that backlash, that counter point to that through kind of far right movements of going against DEI initiatives, going against feminism. There's been a kind of backpedaling in, there's been a push towards anti-feminist narratives, toxic masculine narratives. How do you see that as a feminist anthropologist? What do you make of this growing backlash against feminism globally? And also, I see that from everywhere online, on TV, promoting hyper-masculine anti-women rhetoric. What is your take on that?
We're talking about people like Andrew Tate, of course, right?
Yes, but not just him, not just limited to him. He is the symbol of everything that we are talking about, but it can be, it's a spectrum, right?
No, that's a fabulous question. And I think it's one that frightens people when somebody uses the word like feminist, right? Your first thought is that this is a very popular counter to the feminist movement is, I don't want to be a feminazi, right? I don't want to be burning my bra in the middle of the street and, fighting for the sake of fighting. And this is my way of looking at the world. I think globally we are going into a new era of great anxieties, right? Everything that represented all securities are falling. They are failing us, right? They are the way in which we thought that, the earth, essentially what we call the Anthropocene, the time of man, right? The time of man is that the world serves us, right? The earth serves us. And a lot of these things are being questioned. Climate change is in there, certainly, right? The way in which we're looking at old guard politics are constantly being...
Late-stage capitalism.
Late-stage capitalism, all these sort of things. This neoliberal existence is constantly there. And so the answer for it is that, is in the coming up of formulas that is DEI, about inclusivity, about diversity, becomes problematic because we've seen the world through a lens of hierarchy. This happens in academia as well, right? Who gets to say what they need to say? Who listens? Who participates? Who has access to these spaces? And in the fold of that, feminists are coming out to say, we need to not just place women, we need to also place people who are indigenous, people who live with disabilities, people who live with, immense amounts of blowback for living their lives in a particular shade or color, right? Colorist movements, casteism. So in that, I think certainly these hyper-masculine spaces are being dismantled, right? And in that dismantling is that the blowback is very simple. Be alpha, be strong, be rich, and we can still continue to conquer, right? Ultimately, the hierarchy of living is that there is a top and there is a bottom. And you need to secure yourself in the top. I also think this goes hand in hand in the way in which we see incel movements that are happening. The idea here is that there are men who are feeling deeply insecure and very lonely in it, right? And that loneliness then gets captured by this narrative of, to hell with everyone. We can solve our problems with this aggression and, almost like violence on multiple stages because that's how we've been doing it in the past. We've lost control of it, right? So people are frightened about that kind of blowback. But I offer a different way of looking at the world. I think it is a sign that feminism is working, right? And I think, if we are always prepared for growing pains, this counter narrative, this very hyper-masculine, dangerous, harmful language is a sign that it is part of the growing pains. We have to be prepared for that kind of friction, for that turbulence, simply because this now opens up an opportunity. It doesn't allow us to fall into silence. If somebody meets me with this, I don't think you should be involved because you're a woman of color and you have no space and historically you shouldn't have been here, rather than meet it with fear and silence, it's an opportunity for me to meet it with mutual understanding.
How should then scholars and educators like yourself respond to this growing movement of hyper-masculinity and almost anti-women rhetoric? Do you engage? Should you engage? would it fuel or fan the flames? How do we think about it? There's this entire narrative or entire discourse that says, well, don't ignore completely the Andrew Tates of the world. Don't even give them any attention, because by doing so, by even mentioning his name, you're fueling his popularity. One more person has learnt his name today because I've said it multiple times on the show. Correct. So how do you see that?
This whole thing about ignorance reminds me of a movie that I recently watched, which is an Avengers movie. And a part of it was that one of the characters said, have you ever felt really alone and just completely remorseful and in absolute pain? What do you do with that? And another character says, push it deep down inside, push it deep down, all the way down. And of course, we learn the moral of the story is you cannot, right? You cannot ignore what is brewing. And I think this is it. We've trained ourselves to come up with one way of justifying our existence. The strategy has to be in the way in which we now engage with the other side, right? And academia is no different, as I said. There's hierarchies to every field that exists. You know this. You know this very well, Mel. And I've experienced this. And the thing is that I'm not here to say that you're replacing one with the other. In the same way in which we say, hey, let's now center people that are coming from Southeast Asia. This is not a way for us to erase white academia with brown voices, although some would argue that you should do that. But this is to say that what you have in terms of representation and power and access should be equal to the other, right? The only reason we're experiencing this is this entire element of scarcity mindset. We think that the pie can only go so far. It's not a pie. It's not a pie. And the fact of the matter is, your growth is my growth. And the moment we recognize that, we can speak to it. However, I think also aligned with that is that the fear also for people like you and I to now be able to openly say, okay, now that we've gotten that out in the open and clearly you are unhappy and uncomfortable and really do not want us here, this is a good time for us to now flood the space. This is why spaces like universities must be occupied by voices of the other constantly, right? And without fear, in a way in which we teach everyone and we teach collectively about the way in which we can continue to learn from each other. So my way is that we constantly talk about feminism as if it's just a woman's movement. It is not. It is a wonderful space to also tell men who are feeling completely alienated, you are an important, gender would also include the study of masculinity, right? And they are male allies. Probably they don't even know that they've been allies all this while. Again, these are spaces in which we recreate it. And that power of change comes with that confrontation both ways continuously until we run out of turbulence.
Growing pains. So what would you say to young scholars, both men and women, who want to pursue a path like yours, who think that maybe they don't have a voice or their voices might not be heard, they might not make it to the upper echelons of academic society? But what would you say to them in terms of, did you know what you knew when you were first starting out in academia?
Not at all.
What would you say to them that you wish had been told to you?
When I realized that my MTV hosting career was down in the drain, it was gone.
That's not a career option.
It was not a career option simply because I was not blonde, and
but also MTV now.
and the kids don't even know what MTV is. The same way the kids don't understand why we do this when we say wind down the window, right? But I think the most valuable thing I have learned in academia actually came from a student of mine when we were learning about migration and gender, to which they of Indian Tamil descent said to me, I came to this class to really learn about what it meant to be a migrant, but really what I walked away with is I learned a lot about myself, and that had to be the toughest lesson ever.
Wow.
Anything meaningful, I think, is difficult. Anything of worth is not easy to make. And I don't think I've ever created, I don't think I've created anything meaningful just yet, but I am in the process of trying to create something meaningful, even if it means it takes me to the end of my life, right? A very important lesson that I wish someone had told me was that also anything meaningful takes time. And that, in this culture of constantly rushing, in this TikTok culture of going fast, is that time is so valuable because time tells us so much about ourselves in the work that we do. these are part of the legacies that we do. If you make it with love, and if you make it with the intention to give back to somebody else, it will bear its fruit. It just takes time. And I wish somebody had told me that, rather than me sort of rushing to every MTV audition in town.
But also wondering, why haven't I achieved success yet at every, you know, arbitrary milestone in your life?
Yeah,
right?
well, success isn't in the self, right? Success is in the way in which somebody can then tell you, I've learned a lot about myself. Success is in the way in which you've given back in many meaningful ways. I think we are a society that's so hung up by accolades and you know, recognition, and that blinds us from the real meaning of the work that we're doing. In academia, it's really about passing on. It's always being about passing on. You give forward what you've received, and we're also hung up with this whole way in which we see ourselves in the lesser. We forget that you and I are incredibly privileged. I'm so privileged to be seated with you today, speaking at the capacity in which somebody might hear and learn. And if that means that this conversation has given life to that, we've done one thing right for the day. Yeah, you and I can go and have a Kit Kat.
Okay, let's go and do that now. Thank you, Vila, for being on the show with me.
Thank you, Mel.
I've loved talking to you.
Always.
Always. That's all we have for you on this episode of The Future is Female. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.